The Municipal Archives in Calhoun County House, a peculiar deposition that has long frustrated Texas historians attempting to reconstruct the internal economies of the coastal slave trade. Dated November 3, 1859, the document is a sworn affidavit from a New Orleans cotton factor named Augustus St. Clair, who sought to divest himself of a particular piece of human property with uncharacteristic urgency. Unlike standard bills of sale that casually reduced human lives to metrics of age and physical capacity, this legal instrument carried a desperate tone, emphasizing a full disclosure of liabilities rather than an enumeration of assets. Seclair's testimony detailed a frantic fortnight during which he had attempted to transport a man named Cato downriver, only to encounter a series of inexplicable logistical failures and growing unrest among his other holdings. The affidavit concludes with a warning that future owners should be wary of subversive intellectual engagement, a phrase that reads as an oxymoron within the context of the antebellum marketplace. Seclair's previous experience with Cato had been brief but catastrophic for his sense of commercial order. He had acquired the man through a private estate settlement in Alabama, initially valuing him as a prime field hand capable of immense physical labor. However, the affidavit references an attached addendum from the previous holder, a plantation mistress in Mobile, who described how Cato had reorganized her household accounts with terrifying precision after merely observing her steward struggle for a single afternoon. St. Clair wrote of his own humiliation when Cato, upon hearing a complex dispute regarding shipping weights and moisture content of cotton bales, quietly corrected the calculations of a seasoned freight captain. The correction was exact, saving St. Clair a significant sum, yet it instilled a deep paranoia in the factor, who recognized that such capability in a chattel slave represented not an asset, but a fundamental threat to the rigid social hierarchy required for business. The urgency of the sale was compounded by the specific political climate of late 1859. St. Clair noted in his deposition that the recent turmoil at Harper's Ferry had made the ownership of dangerously intelligent Negroes a subject of acute anxiety throughout the Lower South. He feared that keeping a man who could quote constitutional law and perform advanced calculus would attract the scrutiny of vigilance committees, potentially accusing St. Clair of harboring a radical instigator. The affidavit explicitly states his desire to wash his hands of the philosophical quandary that Cato represented. He was not selling a worker. He was exiling a problem. To facilitate a quick transaction, he arranged for transport to the Texas coast, a region he considered less scrutinizing, but equally desperate for labor, hoping the vast distances of the frontier might absorb the anomaly. The journey across the Gulf of Mexico aboard the steamer the Magnolia serves as the subject of the second piece of documentary evidence attached to the affidavit, a captain's log entry from a man named Captain Holloway. Dated October 29th, the log describes a voyage plagued by unnatural stillness among the cargo. Holloway wrote of an incident during a squall off the Louisiana Barrier Islands when the ship's navigator was incapacitated by fever. According to the log, Cato, who was shackled below deck, correctly predicted the storm's trajectory using nothing but the smell of the air and the motion of the vessel, advising the helmsman to adjust course or risk foundering on a hidden shoal. Holloway initially dismissed the warning as insolence, but subsequent events proved the enslaved man's assessment accurate to a terrifying degree. The log entry continues to detail a profound shift in the shipboard dynamic, transforming the vessel into a floating psychological experiment. Holloway recounted how, for the remainder of the voyage to Indianola, the crew found themselves avoiding the hold where Cato was kept, unsettled by the weight of the silence that emanated from the area. The captain admitted in his private log that he had engaged the slave in a conversation regarding maritime law and international trade routes, only to find his own decades of experience outmatched by the captive's theoretical knowledge. This interaction left Holloway deeply shaken, confessing that he felt as though he were transporting a judge in irons rather than a field hand. He noted that upon docking, he sternly advised St. Clair's agent to complete the sale before the man's influence could spread to the other 200 enslaved individuals on board. When the steamer finally docked at the bustling port of Indianola, the atmosphere was thick with the tension documented in the manifests of the local receiving house. St. Clair had arranged for Cato to be transferred immediately to the custody of a commission merchant named Silas Thorne, a man whose reputation in Calhoun County rested on his ability to liquidate difficult assets with discretion. Thorne's ledger entry for November 5th reflects the arrival of the cargo, describing Cato not with the usual physical descriptors of scars or musculature, but with a single stark annotation. Special instruction: do not engage in conversation. The merchant recognized that the usual marketing of the auction block, where buyers examine teeth and limbs, would be insufficient and potentially dangerous for a commodity that had terrified a seasoned river captain and a cotton factor in equal measure. Thorne's personal diary, preserved within the Calhoun County Historical Collection, offers a candid assessment of his hesitation regarding the upcoming sale. He wrote of sleepless nights spent reviewing the letters of testimony that traveled with the captive, documents that painted a portrait of a mind operating on a level that defied the natural order as Thorne understood it. He feared that presenting a man who could discuss philosophy better than the local magistrates would invite either mockery or hostility from the potential buyers, wealthy planters who relied on the intellectual inferiority of their labor force to justify their dominance. Thorne confessed that he considered simply hiding the accompanying paperwork, but the fear of a future lawsuit based on a defective product stayed his hand, forcing him to proceed with a transparency that he knew would depress the final hammer price. The pseudo-documentary record next turns to the preparation of the auction catalog, a fragile broadside printed on cheap rag paper. The entry for Lot 9, which would later be crossed out in red ink, lists Cato as a prime field hand, followed by a bizarre, italicized caveat that read, "possessing uncommon aptitudes." Thorne had agonized over the phrasing for hours, attempting to comply with the seller's demand for honesty without scaring away the rough-hewn planters who frequented his auction yard. He included a notation regarding the man's ability to read and write, a skill usually suppressed by law, framing it as a novelty rather than the profound danger that St. Clair's affidavit had suggested. B. The catalog stands as a testament to the merchant's doomed attempt to fit a radical impossibility into the mundane ledger of human commerce. Historians examining the Indianola Custom House records from that period note a distinct spike in security costs for the days leading up to the auction. Thorne had ordered double watches for the holding pens, not because he feared escape, but because he feared communication. The fear of contamination, the idea that Cato's intellectual presence might ignite a spark of inquiry in the minds of the other 150 souls awaiting sale, permeates the expense reports. Guards were instructed to keep him isolated in a separate wooden cell, away from the main stockade. This isolation was meant to preserve the status quo, yet according to later oral histories collected from the region, the mere rumor of the thinking man in the holding pen spread through the port town's enslaved community with a speed that no physical barrier could arrest. On the morning of the sale, the sky over Indianola was overcast, a detail noted in the diary of a local schoolteacher who had come to observe the spectacle. The auction block, usually a theater of crude commerce, felt different that day. Thorne stood before the crowd with the stack of testimonies from St. Clair and Captain Holloway in his hand, visibly reluctant to begin the bidding. The potential buyers, a mix of coastal ranchers and inland cotton planters, shuffled their feet impatiently, sensing the auctioneer's hesitation. They were accustomed to buying strength and endurance, but the document Thorne held seemed to pulse with a different kind of weight, a weight of ideas that threatened to upset the transaction they were about to conduct. The tension was palpable, a physical pressure in the humid air, as the merchant prepared to offer a genius to a system designed for beasts of burden. The auction commenced at precisely 10 o'clock on the morning of November 4th, 1859, amidst the stifling humidity of the Indianola Custom House yard. Silas Thorne stood atop the wooden platform, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he held the gavel, a detail noted by a clerk in the margin of the day's ledger. The crowd of potential buyers was smaller than usual for a sale of this size, as word of the peculiar inventory had circulated through the coffee houses and taverns of the port, dampening the enthusiasm of those who preferred their human property simple and biddable. Thorne cleared his throat, his voice barely carrying over the shuffle of boots and the distant cry of gulls, as he prepared to introduce the anomaly that had unsettled his professional composure for the past 48 hours. He knew that the next few minutes would either salvage his reputation or cement his status as a laughingstock in the coastal trade. Thorne began the proceeding by reading the summary of the attached testimonies, a departure from the standard practice of beginning with a physical inspection. As he recited the claims of linguistic fluency and mathematical prediction, a murmur of disbelief rippled through the assembled planters, quickly hardening into audible scoffs and rustling impatience. Men who had driven miles to purchase labor for the harvest season shifted uncomfortably, viewing the auctioneer's preamble not as a warning, but as a bizarre waste of their time. To the crowd, the description of a slave who could outcalculate a university professor sounded like a carnival hoax, or worse, a veiled abolitionist stunt designed to mock the very foundation of their commerce. The atmosphere grew heavy with suspicion, the buyers' eyes narrowing as they scanned the platform for any sign of deception. When Thorne finally gave the signal for the handlers to bring forward Lot 9, Cato emerged from the holding pen with a gait that silenced the crowd's derisive chatter. He walked with a deliberate, measured pace that lacked the coerced shuffling or the terrified stiffness usually exhibited by those about to be sold. His attire was simple and clean, but he carried his body with a verticality that seemed to challenge the very geometry of the auction block. Witnesses later described his gaze as being not downcast, but horizontally focused, scanning the horizon of the crowd with a detached curiosity that felt profoundly out of place in chains. It was a physical manifestation of the intellectual weight described in the documents, a presence that made the whip and the pistol on the hips of the overseers seem suddenly inadequate. The initial bidding opened with a desperate lowball from Thorne, who attempted to spark competition by asking for an opening bid of $600, a figure far below the market rate for a prime field hand in 1859. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind rattling the tin roof of the custom house shed. The planters stared back at Thorne, their arms crossed, refusing to engage with a commodity that carried such puzzling warnings. They were men of practicality, who dealt in muscle and yield. The idea of purchasing a man described as a philosophical liability struck them as both foolish and potentially dangerous to the rigid discipline of their own plantations. The auctioneer's voice cracked as he dropped the asking price again, searching for any anchor in the sea of rejection. Just as Thorne prepared to withdraw the lot, a figure detached himself from the shadow of a pillar at the rear of the crowd. Elias Sterling, a planter whose family holdings stretched across the fertile prairies of the interior, stepped forward with an expression of intense, predatory interest. Unlike his peers, who saw only risk in Cato's described intellect, Sterling saw a puzzle to be solved and a resource to be exploited. He had built his fortune by identifying undervalued assets and extracting their worth, and the terror that the documents had inspired in others only fueled his own arrogance. He believed himself capable of managing what lesser men feared, viewing the auctioneer's panic as an opportunity to acquire a bargain that would humiliate his competitors. Sterling raised his hand, offering the paltry sum of $380, a price that sent a visible wave of shock through the other attendees. The bid was insultingly low, less than half the value of a sound field hand, and effectively a declaration that the man on the block was damaged goods. Thorne, desperate to conclude the transaction before the buyer could change his mind, slammed his gavel down with a speed that ignored the traditional cadence of going once, going twice. The sale was recorded in the ledger as final, the ink still wet, as Sterling stepped forward to sign the bill of sale with a flourish. The transaction was not recorded as a triumph, but as a disposal, with Thorne noting in his private journal that he felt as if he had just handed a lit torch to a man standing in a powder magazine. The post-sale paperwork was conducted with a haste that bordered on the comical, with Thorne practically thrusting the title and the warning documents into Sterling's hands. The planter accepted the folder with a dismissive wave, tucking it under his arm without bothering to review the contents he had already skimmed earlier that morning. He seemed entirely unbothered by the legal warnings regarding the man's propensity for intellectual engagement, dismissing them as the neuroses of a nervous broker. Sterling's confidence was absolute, rooted in a worldview that could not conceive of a slave outsmarting a master of his own standing. He saw the $380 not as a payment for a human life, but as the entry fee for a curiosity that would amuse his guests and streamline his estate's accounts. As the transaction concluded, a subtle shift in the crowd's demeanor indicated that the drama was not entirely over. The other planters, realizing that Sterling had indeed acquired a potentially valuable worker for the price of a used carriage, began to murmur among themselves, questioning whether they had allowed fear to cheat them out of a deal. This aftercurrent of envy was quickly suppressed by the collective memory of the testimonies, however, as the local rumor mill reasserted the danger of the purchase. The men parted to let Sterling and his new property pass, creating a wide berth that spoke volumes about their ambivalence, a mix of respect for Sterling's boldness and pity for the trouble they were certain he had just bought. The mechanics of the transfer were executed with clinical efficiency, documented in a receipt for iron and shackles, found in the Sterling family papers. Cato was secured in the back of a sturdy wagon, not with the heavy chains reserved for violent convicts, but with a light rope that suggested a compromise between the standard security protocols and the recognition of his docile behavior. Sterling climbed onto the buckboard seat, taking the reins himself, rather than delegating the task to a hired driver, perhaps signaling his desire to maintain immediate control over this strange new acquisition. The wagon began to roll away from the Indianola Custom House, the creaking wheels marking the start of a journey inland that would soon unravel the fabric of one of Texas's most prosperous estates. Historians analyzing the November 4th auction argue that Thorne's frantic sale represented a structural breach in the slave market's defense mechanisms. The market was designed to commodify human bodies, but it possessed no mechanism to price human brilliance that originated from the enslaved class. By treating intellect as a defect, a liability to be disclosed, Thorne inadvertently admitted that the system's hierarchy was fragile. Sterling's purchase, therefore, was not merely a financial transaction. It was the injection of a foreign element into a closed ecosystem. As the wagon disappeared into the dust of the coastal road, the port of Indianola returned to its business, but the ledger entry for that day remains a stark testament to a moment when the logic of chattel slavery faltered before the reality of a superior mind. The journey from the coast to the inland prairies took the better part of 2 days, a period documented only by the mileage log Sterling kept in his personal traveling desk. The wagon rattled over the crude dirt tracks that served as roads in that part of the state, passing through scrubby post oak forests before opening onto the vast, flat expanses of the coastal plains. During this transit, Sterling maintained a watchful silence, observing Cato in the rearview mirror of the wagon with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. He was assessing not just the man's physical endurance, which seemed robust, but his temperament, looking for signs of the agitation that had so spooked the seller. To Sterling's surprise, Cato sat with the stillness of a statue, his eyes tracking the landscape with the precision of a surveyor, seemingly unbothered by the chains that still bound his wrists. Upon arriving at Cypress Grove, the Sterling family's sprawling estate near the Garcetas Creek, the planter immediately diverged from standard protocol regarding new acquisitions. Instead of turning Cato over to the overseer for the usual seasoning period in the quarters, Sterling ordered that he be housed in a small, isolated room above the stable. This decision, noted in the estate's daybook as a measure for close observation, was the first structural deviation that signaled Cato's unique status. The other 140 enslaved individuals on the plantation watched this breach of custom with wary eyes, recognizing that the new arrival was being treated with a caution usually reserved for wild animals or rare artifacts, setting him apart from the communal suffering of the field hands. Sterling's initial plan was to verify the auctioneer's claims through a series of practical tests, treating the man as one might test a new piece of machinery. On the first evening, he brought a stack of plantation records into the stable loft, spreading them across a rough wooden table under the flickering light of a whale oil lamp. He instructed Cato to review the previous year's cotton yields and identify any discrepancies in the weights and measures. Sterling expected the man to struggle with the columns of figures, perhaps revealing that the linguistic claims were mere tricks. Instead, Cato scanned the pages with a rapid, rhythmic motion, his eyes moving not left to right, but seemingly absorbing the whole page at once, like water soaking into parched earth. Within minutes, Cato identified a systematic error in the ginning weights that had cost the plantation a significant amount over the harvest season. He explained, in a voice that Sterling would later describe in his journal as annoyingly articulate, how the moisture content of the bales had been miscalculated against the dry weight standards used by the factors in Indianola. The error was subtle, buried in the math, and had been overlooked by Sterling and his overseers for nearly a decade. Sterling sat back in his chair, the implications of the correction settling heavily upon him. The man he had purchased for $380 had just recouped his purchase price 10 times over in a single glance. The psychological stakes escalated the following afternoon when Sterling decided to test the limits of Cato's memory, a feat that required no tools but the mind itself. The planter retrieved a leather-bound volume of agricultural essays from his private library, a book he prized for its complex scientific charts and dense prose. He opened the book to a random chapter regarding soil acidity and crop rotation, instructing Cato to read a single page for exactly 30 seconds. Sterling watched the second hand of his pocket watch tick by, the silence in the stable loft broken only by the distant sound of the cotton gin. When the time elapsed, Sterling snapped the book shut, concealing the text from view. Sterling demanded a recitation of the first paragraph, expecting a summary or a paraphrase. What he received was a verbatim delivery, including the footnotes and the printer's marginalia. Cato spoke the text with the same neutral cadence he used for conversation, his voice lacking the hesitation of recall, but possessing the rhythm of a script reader. He did not miss a comma or a period, and when Sterling challenged him to explain the meaning of a specific chemical formula, mentioned in the text, Cato provided a breakdown of the molecular interaction that the author had only implied. The demonstration moved beyond mere novelty. It entered the realm of the uncanny, a display of cognitive power that made Stirling feel suddenly, acutely, less intelligent in his own home. The tension in the room shifted from skepticism to a vertigo-like disorientation. Stirling, a man who prided himself on his education and his command of the sciences, found himself conversing with a slave about topics that his neighbors could barely grasp. Cato displayed a working knowledge of chemistry and agronomy that surpassed the local doctor's understanding of medicine. The power dynamic inherent in the master-slave relationship began to warp under the pressure of this intellectual imbalance. Stirling realized that he was not merely observing a clever trick. He was in the presence of a mind that operated on a frequency he could barely hear, let alone control. A week into this assessment period, Stirling abandoned the pretense of physical labor for Cato entirely. He moved the man from the stable loft to a corner of his own study, a violation of social norms so drastic that he ordered the house servants to keep the curtains drawn. He began to use Cato as a living calculator, posing complex logistical problems regarding the transport of goods to the coast and the management of livestock herds. Cato solved them instantly, proposing a routing system for the wagons that would shave 2 full days off the trip to the port, a logistical optimization that Stirling had failed to achieve in 15 years of management. The personal diary of Elias Stirling, dated November 15, 1859, reveals the cracking facade of his arrogance. In an entry stained with what appears to be ink blots from a nervous hand, he wrote of the terrifying precision of his new acquisition. He confessed that he found himself hesitating before speaking to Cato, carefully choosing his words to avoid sounding foolish, a behavior he had never exhibited toward any man, white or black. The master had entered the room expecting to find a useful tool. Instead, he found a mirror that reflected the limits of his own competence, and the reflection was growing brighter and more unsettling by the hour. The isolation of Cypress Grove, once a sanctuary of power for Stirling, began to feel like a cage where a dangerous secret was being kept. The study, lined with books that Cato seemed to know better than their owner, transformed from a place of leisure into an interrogation chamber where Stirling was the one being tested. He had purchased a bargain at the auction block, but the true cost of that transaction was beginning to dawn on him. Intelligence, he was learning, was not a commodity that could be owned. It was a force of nature that could not be contained by chains or legal titles. The documents from Indianola had warned of a liability, but they had failed to articulate the profound existential threat that a superior mind posed to the fragile ego of the master class. By late November, the testing phase had concluded, not with a final exam, but with a silent acknowledgement of reality. Stirling no longer sought to expose Cato as a fraud. He was now desperately trying to understand how to coexist with a phenomenon that defied every racial theory he had been taught since childhood. The plantation outside the window operated on the labor of 140 souls, but the mind inside the study was beginning to dominate the will of the master. The assessment was over, and the result was a terrifying draw. Stirling held the deed, but Cato held the intellectual high ground, a position that would soon make the architecture of slavery at Cypress Grove untenable. The operational structure of Cypress Grove began to shift almost immediately following the conclusion of Stirling's private assessment, a change documented through the subtle evolution of the plantation's daily ledger entries. By the first week of December, 1859, the notations regarding labor allocation were no longer written solely in Stirling's hand. They reflected decisions that seemed to prioritize efficiency over tradition. Stirling had installed Cato in a small anteroom adjacent to his study, a physical proximity that signaled a profound breach in the social order. The other house servants, moving like ghosts through the corridors, noted that the door to the study was often closed for hours, a deviation from the open house management style Sterling had previously maintained, suggesting that the nature of the business being conducted inside was not meant for the ears of the overseer. The overseer, a stern man named Hatcher, was the first to formally register the destabilizing shift in the plantation's hierarchy. In a letter to his brother in Georgia, later discovered in a descendant's attic, Hatcher complained of being undercut in his authority regarding the winter wheat planting. He had ordered the field hands to begin sowing in the lower bottoms, following the standard lunar calendar used by planters in the region. However, Sterling had countermanded the order, citing a recommendation from Cato that the soil temperature was insufficient and would result in a failed germination. Hatcher wrote with a mixture of fury and confusion, unable to comprehend how a field hand could override a seasoned overseer on a matter of agronomy, and he warned that such deviations would soon lead to a breakdown in discipline. Hatcher's fears proved well-founded when the rest of the enslaved population began to perceive the shifting gravity of power on the estate. The grapevine telegraph, the informal communication network that connected the quarters to the big house, buzzed with news of the professor in the study. Field hands began to approach Cato during the rare moments he was allowed outside, asking him to interpret letters or settle disputes that the overseer had failed to resolve justly. This quiet deference undermined the terror-based governance that Hatcher relied upon to maintain productivity. The slaves were not rebelling, but they were beginning to look toward a new center of authority, one that offered logic and fairness, rather than the arbitrary whip, a psychological migration that terrified the white management. Sterling, blinded by his intellectual fascination with Cato, failed to see the structural rot taking hold in the quarters, but the financial records show he was not immune to the practical results. The productivity reports for December indicated a spike in efficiency that had nothing to do with increased physical effort. Cato had reorganized the processing schedules for the ginning shed, synchronizing them with the arrival of the supply wagons to minimize idle time. Sterling, mesmerized by the elegance of the solution, began to treat Cato not as a slave, but as a high-ranking steward, asking his opinion on market trends and banknotes. This reliance was documented in the ledger where Sterling began initialing CS next to Cato's suggestions, a notation that would later baffle historians unfamiliar with the internal dynamics of the estate. The tension reached a new threshold during the preparation for the New Year's settlements, a time of intense accounting and financial anxiety for Texas planters. Sterling sat with his books open, struggling to reconcile a discrepancy in the credit lines extended by a factor in New Orleans. According to a memorandum preserved in the estate papers, Cato stood by the fireplace, not touching the ledger, and quietly pointed out that the factor had applied a fluctuating exchange rate on the English cloth purchases that disadvantaged Sterling by nearly 2%. He recalculated the entire debt mentally, proposing a new payment schedule that would capitalize on the seasonal cotton prices. Sterling, initially defensive, verified the math and found it flawless, realizing he was being advised by a man in chains on how to manage his wealth. This incident marked a critical escalation in the emotional stakes for Sterling. The thrill of the bargain he had secured at the auction block began to curdle into a profound sense of inadequacy. He found himself dreading their morning sessions, aware that Cato's intellect was not merely a tool to be used, but a judgment that was constantly being rendered. The master-slave relationship requires a belief in the innate superiority of the master. Cato's presence, with his effortless calculations and nuanced understanding of global economics, made that belief impossible to sustain. Sterling was losing the psychological war on his own plantation, outmaneuvered by a mind he legally owned but could not match. By mid-January, the isolation that had protected Sterling from public scrutiny began to erode. Neighboring planters, including a man named Tolland from a nearby property, began to notice the changes at Cypress Grove. Tolland wrote in his diary about a visit where he found Cato in the study, casually correcting a map survey that Tolland had brought over for consultation. Tolland described the scene as unnatural, noting the way Cato's eyes held a quiet mastery that made the white men in the room feel like interlopers. The visit ended abruptly, and Tolland departed with a warning to Sterling that he was courting disaster by elevating a slave to the status of a clerk, a warning that hinted at the coming social retribution. The internal pressure on Sterling mounted as he began to recognize the contagion effect that Hatcher had warned about. The field hands were becoming more assertive, asking for Mr. Cato's reasoning when given orders they disliked. This intellectual resistance was far more dangerous to the system than a physical revolt, as it challenged the legitimacy of the command structure itself. Sterling realized that he had introduced a virus into the closed system of the plantation, one that was spreading from the study to the fields. The efficiency gains he had celebrated were now overshadowed by the terrifying prospect of a workforce that had learned to think for itself. Historical analysis of the Cypress Grove records from this period highlights a distinct shift in the tone of Sterling's personal correspondence. His letters to friends, once filled with braggadocio about his crops and his successful acquisitions, became guarded and abstract. He stopped inviting neighbors to hunt or dine, effectively walling himself off from the community that had validated his status. He was becoming a prisoner of his own secret, trapped between the public lie of racial superiority and the private truth of Cato's genius. The silent coup was complete. The master still sat in the chair, but the mind of the plantation was no longer his own. The winter of early 1860 brought with it a heavy, damp cold that seemed to settle into the bones of the estate, mirroring the chill that had developed between Sterling and his peers. The operational success of the plantation was at an all-time high, with projections showing a potential record profit for the coming season. Yet the atmosphere in the big house was one of siege. Sterling paced the floorboards at night, tormented by the realization that his financial success was entirely dependent on a man he had no right to own, and worse, a man who knew it. The asset had become the master, and the master had become the reluctant guardian of a truth that could burn the entire edifice of Southern society to the ground. The climax of this silent coup was not a confrontation, but a quiet moment of submission that occurred in late January. Sterling, facing a complex decision about diversifying his holdings into sugarcane, found himself walking to the study door to ask Cato for advice, not as a master issuing a query, but as a petitioner seeking wisdom. He stopped with his hand on the latch, the cold brass biting into his palm, realizing the inversion was total. He was consulting his property on the disposition of his fortune. The illusion of mastery had dissolved, leaving behind a vacuum that Cato's intellect had quietly filled, setting the stage for the inevitable explosion that would shatter the silence. The fragile equilibrium at Cypress Grove was shattered on a humid afternoon in early March of 1860, a date marked by a sudden change in the notation style of the Plantation Journal. Elias Sterling, exhausted from a night of sleepless pacing, entered the study to find Cato standing by the window, staring out at the quarters with an expression that transcended his usual neutrality. The air in the room was heavy with the dust motes dancing in the light, a stark contrast to the turbulent thoughts Sterling struggled to suppress. He had come to the realization that he could no longer maintain the charade of ownership over a mind that so clearly outpaced his own, and the cognitive dissonance had begun to manifest in physical ailments. Sterling dropped heavily into his leather chair, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room, and demanded that Cato explain how he could remain so calm while legally bound to serve a man of lesser intellect. Cato turned from the window, his movements deliberate and composed, and delivered a response that would later be reconstructed from the fragmented memories of a house servant eavesdropping in the hallway. He spoke not with the deference of a slave, but with the precision of a philosopher diagnosing a societal illness. He explained that his intellect was not a weapon he wielded against Sterling, but a natural force that the institution of slavery could not contain, much like a levee attempting to hold back a river in flood. He argued that the discomfort Sterling felt was the inevitable result of trying to fit a boundless human potential into the cramped container of chattel property. The conversation was no longer about labor or management. It was an existential trial where the master found himself the defendant. The tension escalated when Sterling, grasping for a final defense of his worldview, accused Cato of manipulating the estate's operations to undermine white authority. It was a desperate charge, born of insecurity rather than evidence. Cato met the accusation with a calm dismantling of the planter's logic, pointing out that every suggestion he had made had increased Sterling's wealth and solidified his standing among his peers, making the accusation not only false, but irrational. He used Sterling's own account books as evidence, reciting from memory the exact figures that proved his contributions had been purely benevolent. This defense, delivered without a hint of malice, only deepened Sterling's sense of inadequacy, stripping away the planter's final illusion of control. The confrontation reached its emotional zenith when Cato questioned the moral foundation of their relationship. He asked Sterling why the recognition of his humanity was contingent upon the display of superior capability rather than being an inherent right. This query, preserved in a letter Sterling later wrote to his brother, struck at the core of the Southern justification for slavery. Cato was forcing Sterling to admit that the only thing keeping him in chains was the color of his skin and the law's distortion of reality, not any deficiency in his character or mind. The question hung in the air, unanswerable within the framework of the society they inhabited, leaving Sterling in a state of profound moral vertigo. A week later, the situation reached a breaking point during a routine review of the spring planting schedules. A house servant named Liza, who was cleaning the hearth, witnessed the moment Sterling snapped. He threw his ledger across the room, the spine cracking against the stone mantelpiece, and shouted that he could no longer endure the daily reminder of his own intellectual fraud. He confessed aloud that he felt like a trespasser in his own study, a man playing a role he was no longer qualified to fill. The silent coup had finally vocalized itself. The master had publicly admitted his defeat, not to a rebellion of arms, but to a revolution of competence. The hysteria in the room was palpable as Sterling began to pace, his hands shaking, admitting that he had begun to see the faces of the other enslaved workers differently. He confessed that Cato's brilliance had acted as a lens, bringing the full humanity of every individual on the plantation into sharp, uncomfortable focus. He could no longer look at the field hands and see mere units of labor. He saw people whose potential was being crushed by a system he upheld. This admission was the crack in the dam, the psychological collapse that the previous months of intellectual intimacy had been building toward. Sterling was not just losing his authority, he was losing his ability to deceive himself. In a moment of frantic desperation, Sterling offered to sell Cato back to a trader, promising him a chance at a better life elsewhere. But Cato refused the offer with a stoic finality. He stated that being sold would merely transfer his predicament to another location, and that his unique intelligence would always mark him as a target for fear or exploitation. He argued that Sterling was the only man who had seen the truth of his capabilities, and therefore the only man capable of making the right decision, however difficult. He challenged Sterling to do the one thing that the economics of the South deemed impossible: to prioritize his conscience over his portfolio. The emotional toll of this exchange is documented in the physical deterioration of Sterling's own handwriting in his diary entries from that week. The script becomes jagged and erratic, reflecting a man under immense psychological strain. He wrote of feeling haunted by the perfect logic of a man I own, describing the moral weight of Cato's presence as heavier than any physical chain. He realized that keeping Cato enslaved was an act of daily violence against a truth he could no longer deny, a truth that stated intelligence and humanity were not the exclusive domain of the white race. The climax of this period was not a physical event, but a silent, internal surrender that occurred late one evening. Sterling sat alone in the dark study, the ledgers closed and stacked on the floor, realizing that the financial success of Cypress Grove was built on a foundation of lies. The efficiency, the profits, the optimized logistics, all of it was tainted by the fact that the mind responsible for it was held in bondage. He understood that to continue as before was to accept a life of hypocrisy that his own intellect could no longer sanction. The mirror that Cato held up had shattered Sterling's self-image irrevocably. This period of crisis concluded with a decision that Sterling recorded in a single cryptic line in his diary on March 20th, 1860. He wrote simply that the accounts must be settled in full, a metaphor that signaled his intent to resolve the moral debt he had accumulated. The intellectual sparring was over. The time for action had arrived. The collision of mind and system had reached its inevitable conclusion, forcing the master to choose between his status and his soul. The stakes had escalated from the management of a plantation to the salvation of his own moral standing in the eyes of history and his own conscience. The transition from philosophical struggle to concrete action began the very next morning, as Sterling drafted a letter to his attorney in Indianola, bypassing the local legal channels. He was preparing to dismantle the structure of his own authority, a process that would begin with the man who had exposed its fragility. The confrontation had stripped away the comforting fictions of the planter class, leaving Sterling raw and exposed, but also, strangely, resolved. He was ready to perform an act that would cost him everything he had built, driven to it by the impossible integrity of the man he had purchased for $380. The legal mechanics of severing the bond between master and slave in Texas required a precision that Elias Sterling found agonizing, a process documented in the stiff, formal language of the Calhoun County court records. On March 26, 1860, Sterling summoned his attorney, a man named Julian Harcourt, to the main house at Cypress Grove. Harcourt, accustomed to drafting wills and property transfers, arrived expecting to document a sale or a loan consolidation. Instead, he was presented with a request that defied the economic logic of the region: the drafting of a deed of manumission for Cato. The attorney's initial reaction was one of professional alarm, warning Sterling that such an act would be viewed as a betrayal of the planter class and could expose him to social ruin and financial scrutiny. Sterling dismissed Harcourt's concerns with a finality that signaled his resolution was not subject to negotiation. The document, drafted on expensive vellum paper, lists the physical description of Cato: height, complexion, approximate age, and formally releases him from the claims of service that had constituted his legal existence. The language of the deed is standard for the era, yet the signature at the bottom, large and jagged, betrays the emotional cost of the transaction. Sterling was not merely signing away a piece of property valued at over $1,000. He was legally acknowledging that the man standing before him possessed a right to liberty that superseded the laws of commerce, a radical admission in a society built on the commodification of human life. The financial details of the separation were recorded meticulously in the estate ledger, creating a jarring contrast between the emotional weight of the moment and the cold arithmetic of the accounts. Sterling entered a credit for Cato's purchase price, $380, and added a separate debit for traveling expenses amounting to $60. This sum, substantial for a newly freed man, was handed over in a small leather pouch containing gold coins and banknotes. The ledger notation reads simply, "Account settled," a sterile phrase that belies the magnitude of the transfer. Sterling was effectively paying for the privilege of correcting a moral error, a transaction that baffled the clerks who later reviewed the books. The atmosphere in the study during the signing was suffocatingly quiet, noted by a house servant who later described the scene to an interviewer in the 1930s. There was no celebration, no joyous outburst, only a heavy solemnity that hung in the air like smoke. Cato stood across the desk from Sterling, watching the attorney affix the official seal to the paper. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Sterling sat as the petitioner of his own conscience, while Cato stood as the recipient of a long-denied justice. The silence was broken only by the scratching of the quill and the distant sounds of the plantation continuing its operations, oblivious to the rupture occurring within the big house. When the documents were finally complete, Sterling handed the papers and the money to Cato with a hand that trembled visibly. He offered a warning about the dangers that lay ahead, noting that Texas law required freedmen to leave the state within 90 days or face re-enslavement. This legal constraint, often ignored by the courts when it suited white planters, would now be the governing reality of Cato's life. Sterling advised him to head north with all possible speed, toward the contested territories where his papers might offer some protection, or perhaps to the coast, where a ship could take him to the free states of the North. Cato accepted the manumission papers, examining them with the same analytical precision he applied to everything else. He folded the document carefully and placed it inside his jacket, an action that transformed his posture from one of subservience to one of autonomy. He asked Sterling a single pointed question: why he had chosen to perform this act when he could have easily sold him for a profit to a distant trader. Sterling's response, later paraphrased in a letter to his brother, was that he could no longer endure the tyranny of ownership over a mind greater than his own. It was a confession of moral exhaustion, an admission that the psychological strain of the preceding months had left him no other choice. The departure from Cypress Grove was immediate and unceremonious. Cato did not say goodbye to the other enslaved workers in the quarters, nor did he linger to collect personal effects beyond what he carried. He walked out of the front gate of the estate, a route usually reserved for white guests and family members, turning his back on the fields where he had been forced to labor. The overseer, Hatcher, watched from the porch of his cabin with a look of confused fury, unable to comprehend why a prime hand was being allowed to stroll off the property with money in his pocket and freedom in his hand. Historians examining the events of March 28, 1860, have noted the profound isolation Sterling courted with this decision. In a social structure where wealth was measured in human chattel, freeing a capable worker was an act of economic insanity. The transaction of conscience stripped Sterling of a valuable asset and signaled to his neighbors that he was no longer a reliable participant in the region's primary economy. The financial loss was tangible, but the social capital he forfeited was far greater, marking him as a dangerous anomaly in the tightly knit web of Southern aristocracy. As Cato disappeared down the dirt road that led toward the county seat, Sterling stood by the window of his study, watching until the figure was swallowed by the midday heat haze. The ledger entry for that day remains the only official record of the man's presence. a fleeting line of credit in a book filled with the minutiae of cotton production. Sterling returned to his desk, faced with the silence of a room that now felt emptier, a void created by the absence of the intellect that had dominated his thoughts for months. The problem had been solved, yet the solution left him more unsettled than the dilemma itself. The act of manumission, while resolving the immediate moral crisis for Cato, acted as a detonator for the stability of Cypress Grove. By freeing one man, Sterling had inadvertently illuminated the bondage of the 140 others who remained. The transaction of conscience was complete, but the currency he had used was his own standing in the community, a price that would be collected with interest in the weeks to come. The road leading away from the plantation carried a free man toward a perilous future, while the road leading in would soon bring the consequences of that freedom crashing down upon the master who had dared to grant it. The departure of Cato created a vacuum at Cypress Grove that was immediately filled by a dangerous new commodity: hope. Within hours of the manumission, the grapevine telegraph pulsed with the news, transforming the mundane routines of the quarters into hushed, intense strategy sessions. Field hands who had previously accepted their lot with stoic resignation began to view the master's authority through a lens of brittle skepticism. The silence that had settled over the plantation was not one of peace, but of a held breath as the remaining 140 souls waited to see if the miracle of the study would extend to the fields. Sterling's single act of conscience had inadvertently shattered the illusion of inevitability that underpinned slavery, revealing the system to be a choice rather than a divine ordinance. The overseer, Hatcher, documented his growing alarm in a series of terse notes sent to the county sheriff in the weeks following Cato's exit. He reported a distinct shift in the temperament of the stock, describing a refusal to meet eyes and a sullen delay in obeying commands that bordered on mass insubordination. The psychological barrier that had once prevented the enslaved from envisioning liberty had been breached. If the professor could walk away with papers, then the status quo was no longer absolute. Hatcher pleaded for additional patrols, fearing that the idea of freedom, once planted, would prove more contagious than any physical illness, spreading rapidly through the quarters and threatening the very existence of the plantation's labor force. The escalating tension broke the surface in late April, when a delegation of neighboring planters arrived on Sterling's porch, their horses tethered in a line that blocked the main drive. Led by the formidable planter Tolland, the group represented the enforcement arm of the region's social hierarchy. They had not come for hospitality, but to deliver a verdict. Tolland accused Sterling of unsettling the order by freeing a valuable hand, a violation of the unwritten code that no member of the master class should validate the concept of black competence. The confrontation was a collision of private conscience and public tyranny, with Tolland warning that Sterling's experiment would not be tolerated if it jeopardized the security of the district. Sterling, standing in his own doorway, met their accusations with a defense that stunned his peers into a hostile silence. Instead of offering excuses or promising to tighten discipline, he questioned the foundation of their fear. He asked why the freedom of one man should threaten a system they claimed was natural and divinely ordained. This rhetorical counterattack was a catastrophic error in judgment, confirming the neighbor's suspicions that Sterling had been infected by the very intellect he had owned. By refusing to recant his action, he transitioned from an eccentric neighbor to a pariah, effectively severing himself from the protective circle of the planter aristocracy. The social ostracization was immediate and comprehensive, recorded in the minutes of the local agricultural society and the cold silence of the postal logs. Merchants in Indianola suddenly found themselves unable to extend credit to Cypress Grove and factors in New Orleans began to demand immediate payment on outstanding debts. The economic blockade was designed to force Sterling into compliance, using financial leverage to police the boundaries of racial ideology. Sterling found himself trapped in a siege of his own making, watching his liquidity evaporate as the community tightened the noose, punishing him for the crime of acknowledging a humanity that the law denied. In a desperate bid to salvage his integrity, Sterling drafted a public notice of gradual emancipation for his remaining workforce, proposing a timeline of manumission that would stretch over the next 5 years. This document, filed with the county clerk on June 1, 1860, was a radical challenge to the Southern way of life. It represented an attempt to align his external reality with the internal moral transformation he had undergone. The filing was a bureaucratic bombshell, sending shockwaves through the courthouse and confirming the worst fears of the vigilance committees. Sterling was no longer merely a dissenting voice. He was now an active threat to the institution of slavery itself. The reaction from the white community was swift and violent. Later that night, a fire broke out in the lower barns, consuming the winter feed stores and scorching the edges of the cotton fields. While no formal charges were ever brought, the message was unambiguous. The arson was a tactical warning, a demonstration that the community would not wait for the law to resolve the problem of Elias Sterling. The destruction was estimated at over $3,000, a financial blow that further crippled the estate, signaling that the cost of his conscience would be extracted in the currency of blood and smoke. The chaos on the plantation intensified as the workforce, sensing the master's vulnerability, began to test the limits of their confinement. Small acts of sabotage, broken tools, gates left open, livestock wandered off, began to multiply, documented in the frantic daily entries of Hatcher's journal. The enslaved population recognized that the hierarchy was fracturing, and the promise of future freedom did little to quell the immediate desire for autonomy. Sterling had broken the spell of his own authority, and without the backing of his peers, he lacked the infrastructure of fear necessary to maintain the plantation's operations. The convergence of social exile, economic strangulation, and internal insurrection created a pressure cooker environment at Cypress Grove. Sterling's wife, Martha, wrote to her sister in a letter dated mid-June, describing the estate as a ghost ship drifting without a rudder. She wrote of sleepless nights and the constant fear of violence from both the slaves and the surrounding whites, painting a portrait of a family trapped in a trap of their own making. The moral victory of manumission had come at a devastating price, isolating the family in a sea of hostility with no clear path to survival. By late June, the ambitious emancipation plan Sterling had filed lay dead in the water, a legal curiosity without the funds or political capital to be enacted. The ripples of freedom had returned as a tsunami, threatening to drown the estate entirely. Sterling sat in his study, surrounded by the unsigned checks and legal threats that cluttered his desk, realizing that the momentum he had unleashed was now beyond his control. The act of freeing Cato had not purged the system of its corruption. It had merely illuminated the vast machinery of repression that surrounded him, machinery that was now grinding his own life to dust. The structural integrity of Cypress Grove had failed, and the collapse was now a matter of time. The neighbors who had once envied his efficiency now circled like vultures, waiting for the inevitable foreclosure that would allow them to carve up his holdings. Sterling's attempt to impose a new moral order on an immoral landscape had resulted in his own obsolescence. The narrative arc was hurtling toward a climax of destruction, setting the stage for the final dismantling of the world he had built and the scattering of the people he had tried, and failed, to save. The financial collapse of Cypress Grove is documented with cold precision in the probate records of Calhoun County, filed in the sweltering heat of August 1860. The bankruptcy petition lists assets that were once the envy of the region: cotton gins, livestock, and vast acreages of prime bottomland, now reduced to entries on a creditor's ledger. The gradual emancipation plan that Sterling had naively filed with the county clerk was rendered void the instant the gavel fell in the courtroom, a legal casualty of the foreclosure proceedings. The document, which had promised freedom to over 100 souls, was transformed into a mere historical curiosity, lacking the financial backing to survive the liquidation of the estate. The dispersal of the human property at Cypress Grove represents one of the most tragic footnotes in the region's history. Because the emancipation plan was never funded, the enslaved workforce was seized as collateral to satisfy Sterling's debts. Auction bills from the period advertise a general dispersion of the estate's assets, listing the names of the field hands and house servants who had witnessed Cato's departure with such hope. Families were torn apart as the creditors, neighbors who had once dined at Sterling's table, purchased the laborers at a fraction of their value, effectively punishing the enslaved for the master's moral awakening. Sterling's personal descent from a pillar of the community to a pariah was mirrored by his physical relocation. By September, the big house stood empty, its windows dark and its floors silent, reclaimed by the bank to cover the massive deficits in the operating accounts. Sterling moved to a cramped boarding house in the bustling port of Indianola, taking a position as a clerk in a shipping office, a role that required him to record the very cargoes of cotton and human lives he had once produced. The irony was bitter. The man who had once commanded a vast empire of agriculture now found himself fetching ledger books for merchants he had once bankrolled. The psychological toll of this ruin is evident in the sparse correspondence Sterling maintained with his brother in Georgia. In a letter dated October 10, 1860, his handwriting is noticeably shrunken, the letters small and cramped, reflecting a spirit that had been broken by the weight of societal retribution. He wrote of the terrible silence that followed him in the streets of Indianola, where former friends would cross to the other side of the thoroughfare to avoid acknowledging his existence. He had purchased his conscience at the cost of his entire world, and the isolation was absolute, leaving him to wander the docks as a ghost of his former self. The legal battles continued to drag on through the winter, draining the last remnants of Sterling's savings. Court documents reveal a series of motions filed by his attorney, Julian Harcourt, attempting to retain some portion of the estate for Sterling's wife, Martha. But the odium attached to Sterling's name made the judge unsympathetic. The community had effectively decided that Sterling was a dangerous anomaly, a man who had betrayed his class, and the legal system was used to ensure his total erasure. The final decree of bankruptcy, signed in December, marked the official end of the Sterling dynasty in Texas. While the ruins of Cypress Grove settled into the dust, the narrative lens shifts northward, following the path of the man whose freedom had precipitated the disaster. Cato had traversed the hazardous terrain of East Texas and Louisiana, utilizing his forged papers and his intellect to navigate the checkpoints and patrols that sought to ensnare escaped or manumitted blacks. By the time the final gavel fell on Sterling's estate, Cato had already crossed the border into the free state of Indiana, his journey a stark contrast to the stagnation of his former master. Cato's arrival in the North did not bring the immediate relief often associated with freedom, a reality detailed in a memoir he began drafting in late 1860. He described the Northern prejudice that met him at every turn, a wall of discrimination that was less violent than the South's, but equally impenetrable in terms of economic advancement. He found work in a meatpacking plant in Cincinnati, a job that required brute strength rather than the brilliant mind that had dismantled the logistics of a Texas plantation. The tragedy of his situation was palpable. The very intellect that had liberated him was now forced into hiding to survive the wage labor market. However, the tides of history were beginning to turn in Cato's favor, driven by the escalating national crisis. As the presidential election of 1860 concluded and the southern states began to secede, Cato recognized that his unique skills would soon be in demand. He left the packing plant and moved to a small boarding house near the river docks, positioning himself near the Union Army recruiters who were beginning to gather in the city. The shadow consultant phase of his life was about to begin, as the war machine created a new, urgent appetite for the kind of analytical precision he possessed. The transition from field hand to strategic asset began tentatively in early 1861. Cato started offering his services to Army quartermasters, correcting manifest errors for a modest fee or a warm meal. The military bureaucrats, initially suspicious of a black man offering logistical advice, soon learned to value his accuracy. He worked in the shadows, never signing his name to a report, but his influence began to ripple through the supply chains that fed the Union troops. He was becoming the invisible variable in the equation of the war, a force multiplier hidden in plain sight. The divergence between the two protagonists was now complete. Elias Sterling sat in a cramped room in Indianola, watching the Confederacy he had defied, and been destroyed by, crumble around him, while Cato walked the bustling streets of Cincinnati, a free man whose mind was finally being utilized, however anonymously, for a cause that promised to end the institution that had birthed them both. The ruin of Cypress Grove had been the necessary combustion that propelled Cato into his destiny, leaving Sterling behind in the ashes of a shattered past, setting the stage for a correspondence that would bridge their divided worlds. The archives of the Western Sanitary Commission contain a series of logistical reports from early 1862 that attribute their sudden efficiency in supply distribution to an anonymous calculator. This figure, now confirmed by cross-referenced diaries to be Cato, operated in the liminal space between the Union Army's formal structure and the chaotic reality of the Mississippi River Campaign. He was not listed on any muster roll, nor did he wear a uniform, yet his influence permeated the quartermaster's ledgers. Cato had found a way to weaponize his intellect against the very system that had sought to contain it, turning the abstract mathematics of supply lines into a tangible asset for the war effort, all while maintaining the invisibility required for a black man navigating the racial politics of the Union. Cato's methodology involved identifying bottlenecks in the transport of troops and provisions, a task he performed with the same terrifying precision he had once applied to the cotton yields of Cypress Grove. In a memorandum dated April 14, 1862, a Colonel Burroughs noted that a local colored man had correctly predicted a 3-day delay in river transport due to silt accumulation near Helena, Arkansas, a forecast that saved the regiment from being stranded without rations. The officer admitted in the private margin of the report that he had initially dismissed the advice as Negro superstition, only to find the prediction validated with mathematical exactitude, a humbling admission that underscored the persistent blindness of the military establishment. The emotional landscape of Cato's life during this period was one of profound duality, a theme heavily explored in the personal essays he wrote during the lulls between campaigns. He described the peculiar agony of being essential, yet unacknowledged, a ghost in the machine of the grandest logistical operation the continent had ever seen. His intellect, which had terrified the planters of Texas, was here merely consumed, used to grease the gears of the Union war machine without attribution. He was free, yes, but his freedom was conditional upon his utility, a transactional existence that mirrored the economic dynamics of slavery, albeit with the crucial distinction of volition and a salary of $18 a month. His work soon expanded beyond mere transport logistics into the clandestine networks of the Underground Railroad, which remained active in the border states. Utilizing his photographic memory, Cato acted as a living repository for routes, safe house codes, and conductor schedules, eliminating the need for written documents that could be seized by Confederate sympathizers. Historical records from a Quaker abolitionist group in Cincinnati reference a Professor C, a clear pseudonym, who could recite the entire network of safe passages from memory, allowing them to redirect fugitive traffic instantly when patrols intensified. This shadow work represented a direct continuation of his earlier subversion, using his mind to dismantle the institution piece by piece. Despite his crucial contributions, the racial ceiling of the 19th century remained impenetrable. Cato was barred from the officer clubs and the formal strategy rooms where his insights would have been most valuable. This forced him to operate through intermediaries, white junior officers who would take his calculations and present them as their own. In a letter home, a Union lieutenant confessed to his wife that he felt a moral cramp in taking credit for the strategic insights of a black man, yet he justified it as necessary for maintaining military discipline and social order. The structural racism of the era demanded that Cato's genius remain a stolen resource. The transition from the battlefield to the post-war era brought a new set of challenges for the shadow consultant. With the Confederacy collapsed and the Union victorious, the specific demands for wartime logistics evaporated, leaving Cato in a precarious economic position. He settled in Cincinnati, attempting to leverage his skills into a civilian consultancy, but the white business community was hesitant to engage openly with a black intellectual. He found himself competing not only against racial prejudice, but also against a market that refused to believe a black man could possess the financial acumen he displayed. During the Reconstruction years, Cato's writing took on a more philosophical, weary tone. In a manuscript dated 1867, he reflected on the nature of exceptionalism. He argued that his own survival and success had hinged on being an anomaly, a status that provided no shield for the millions of freedmen who were merely ordinary. He noted that the North, having used the black body to win the war, was now retreating into a comfortable amnesia, unwilling to utilize the black mind for the peace. The shadow consultant was being forced back into the darkness, his utility expired by the shifting tides of politics. A significant breakthrough occurred in 1868 when a Chicago-based rail magnate, desperate to resolve a routing dispute that was costing his company thousands, hired Cato on a strictly private basis. The contract, preserved in the railroad's archives, was made out to a C. Adams, an alias that allowed the magnate to maintain the veneer of segregation while fully exploiting Cato's engineering prowess. Cato solved the routing issue in a single afternoon, optimizing the gradient loads for the locomotives, a feat that had stumped the company's white engineers for months. It was a lucrative engagement, paying him $500, yet it remained a secret, hidden in the corporate archives. The isolation of his intellectual life weighed heavily on him. In his journals, Cato often lamented the absence of peers who could comprehend the vastness of his memory. He wrote of the silence that surrounded him, a silence not of oppression, but of a lack of equals. He possessed a library of thousands of books in his mind, yet he had no one with whom to discuss them. This intellectual solitude was the price of his freedom. He had escaped the physical chains of Cypress Grove, only to be imprisoned in a fortress of his own cognition, separated from the rest of humanity by the sheer scale of his abilities. By 1870, Cato had established a modest routine in Cincinnati, working as a bookkeeper for a black-owned cooperative while continuing his private consultations under various pseudonyms. The shadow consultant had found a way to exist in the interstices of the Gilded Age, contributing to the industrial boom while remaining invisible to the history books being written by the victors. He watched as the promises of Reconstruction began to falter, observing with a bitter clarity that the mathematical precision of supply chains was far easier to manage than the chaotic equations of racial justice in America. The chapter closes with Cato standing on the banks of the Ohio River, a physical barrier that once separated slavery from freedom, now just a muddy vein of commerce. He was a man who had advised generals and optimized railroads, yet he lived in a boarding house under an assumed name. The shadow he cast was long, stretching back to the ruins of Cypress Grove, but the man himself remained obscure, a necessary condition for a black genius to survive in a nation that refused to look him in the eye. The stage was set for the final, fragile reconnection with the past he had left behind, a dialogue conducted through the slow, deliberate medium of the mail. The reconnection between the fallen planter and the freed prodigy began in the winter of 1871, initiated by a letter postmarked from a boarding house in Indianola. Elias Sterling, his hand made unsteady by age and poverty, wrote to a forwarding address in Cincinnati, attempting to bridge the years of silence and the miles of ruin that separated him from Cato. The letter, now part of the Sterling family papers at the Texas State Archives, reveals a man stripped of pretension. Sterling admitted that the collapse of Cypress Grove had left him with nothing but the cold clarity of hindsight, and he sought absolution from the one man who had exposed the fragility of his world. Cato's response arrived 2 months later, the envelope frayed from the long journey, bearing the return address of a modest bookkeeping firm in the north. The language within was measured, devoid of the anger one might expect, yet cutting in its intellectual honesty. Cato acknowledged the material devastation Sterling had suffered, but pointed out the critical distinction between financial ruin and moral redemption. He wrote that Sterling had purchased his own enlightenment at the price of his estate, a transaction that, while catastrophic for his social standing, had preserved the core of his humanity. The correspondence marked the beginning of a dialogue that would define their final years. Throughout the early 1870s, the letters served as a lifeline for both men, each grappling with the aftermath of the war and their shared history. Sterling wrote of the bitterness of his neighbors and the difficulty of finding work in a society that viewed him as a traitor to the lost cause. In return, Cato described the chilling embrace of Northern prejudice, where his intellect was secretly utilized but publicly ignored. These exchanged confessions created a unique bond. They were the only two people on Earth who understood the precise mechanics of the silent coup that had destroyed Cypress Grove, making them unwitting confederates in a moral revolution. A pivotal exchange occurred in 1872, when Sterling confessed his lingering guilt over the 140 souls who had been sold off after his bankruptcy. He expressed his failure to enact the gradual emancipation plan, viewing it as a broken promise that nullified his good intentions. Cato's reply, often cited by historians as a masterclass in ethical analysis, challenged Sterling's despair. He argued that the intent, though unfulfilled, had shattered the psychological chains of the plantation, proving to the enslaved that the system was not invincible. This perspective offered Sterling a form of absolution that the church or the law could never provide. The letters also touched upon the nature of Cato's genius, a subject that had always hovered uneasily between them. Sterling asked if Cato viewed his memory as a divine gift or a biological accident. Cato responded with a philosophical treatise on the burden of total recall, describing his mind as a library without a catalog, where every slight, Every kindness and every injustice was stored with equal permanence. He admitted that this inability to forget was the true source of his power and his suffering, a sentiment that resonated deeply with the aging Sterling, who was then living in a small, drafty apartment in Galveston. The correspondence continued until the spring of 1873, when the letters from Sterling abruptly ceased. A final note from a local physician, tucked into the last returned envelope, informed Cato that Elias Sterling had passed away in his sleep, penniless and largely friendless, a casualty of the war he had tried to preempt. The physician noted that Sterling had died with a copy of Cato's last letter on his nightstand, a testament to the fact that the former slave had become the planter's most trusted moral compass in his final days. Cato's reaction to the news is preserved in a private journal entry dated May 4, 1873. He wrote not of grief, but of a strange, hollow resolution. He acknowledged that Sterling was the only white man in Texas who had seen him fully and had paid the ultimate price for that vision. The entry concludes with a reflection on the tragedy of exception, noting that Sterling had been exceptional among his peers in his capacity for change, yet that exception had proven insufficient to save him or his world. It was a somber obituary for a complex relationship. For the next 2 decades, Cato lived a life of quiet industry in Cincinnati, his existence defined by the shadows that had protected him. The census records of 1880 list him as a clerk, a job title that belied the scope of his contributions to the city's commerce and the Underground Railroad's legacy. He never married, and he kept no servants, living a life of Spartan simplicity that allowed him to focus his mind on his writing and his memories of a Texas plantation that seemed a lifetime away. As the century waned, Cato began to curate his own archive, organizing his letters, journals, and the few remaining documents from Cypress Grove. He understood that the story of his intellect and Sterling's ruin was a dangerous one, challenging the narratives of white superiority that were hardening into Jim Crow law. He entrusted these papers to a local lawyer, with instructions that they be sealed for 50 years, ensuring that the truth of what happened at Cypress Grove would not be buried with him, but would survive to speak to a future, perhaps more just, generation. Cato died in the autumn of 1896, passing away quietly in his sleep at the age of 67. His obituary in the Cincinnati Gazette was a brief 3-line notice that mentioned neither his work for the Union Army nor his pivotal role in the destruction of a Texas dynasty. He was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, his physical presence erased as thoroughly as his contributions had been hidden during his lifetime. The shadow consultant had finally stepped into the total darkness of history. The story of Cato and Elias Sterling lay dormant for decades, hidden in the sealed boxes of a Midwestern law firm and the dusty archives of a Texas courthouse. It was not until the mid-20th century that a historian stumbled upon the cross-referenced correspondence, piecing together the impossible narrative of a slave whose mind outpaced an era and a master who had the courage to lose everything rather than own it. The correspondence and the archive thus became the final act of the drama, proving that while the physical estate of Cypress Grove had crumbled into dust, the truth etched in ink and memory was indestructible.